Hello, welcome. I am Jan Stryjak from Counterpoint Research. I am joined by Biju Nair, EVP and President of Global Connected Living from Assurant. Biju, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jan. Always a pleasure. Look forward to our conversation.
Great. Okay, so let's talk about secondary smartphone market, if that's okay. So, secondary smartphone market is constantly evolving. It's changing kind of up and down. Are you seeing any important dynamics kind of over the last year, 2 years? Maybe let's start from a kind of a consumer demand perspective.
Yeah, we have definitely seen the number of pre-owned devices being shipped in the market rise year after year after year. And I think a few years ago, it surpassed as a percentage of the devices being sold, being even the newer devices, right? So that's been going on for quite some time. The significant trend within that what we are seeing is the certified pre-owned market. The demand for that has really gone up. And the certified pre-owned market is very interesting because it can cater directly to the consumer who just does not want to buy a new device, but it can also cater to insurance industry that is looking to replace devices, etc. But across the spectrum, we have started to see that rise. And we think one of the reasons for that, and there could be many reasons, is the availability of lower end devices, which actually dates back to the right after pandemic, the supply chain constraints. So when you have only so many chips and so many parts available, the smart OEMs are tending towards the higher end and more expensive devices. That creates a glut in the industry for the lower end devices, and consumers are looking to get a pre-owned device, certified pre-owned device to do that. So that's driving some of the growth.
Okay, and that's really interesting. You mentioned the supply chain. So from a supply point of view, we're seeing the new smartphone market is seeing quite a tough time at the moment. So we're seeing global sales are down 6% in 2023. 6%? I got that right. In Europe, things are even worse because we've had the cost of living crisis. Sales are down 10% in 2023, 2022. And annual sales are down by a third compared to where they were pre-COVID. So how is this impacting the secondary smartphone market?
So in a couple of different ways, right? That lack of supply of new devices, particularly on the lower end of the spectrum, right? If you're thinking an iPhone, think about the normal iPhone 15 versus the Pro and the Pro Max, right? So there has been Pro and Pro Maxes have sold a lot, and the regular version of iPhones haven't sold as much, right? And that's primarily because of availability. And so as a result of that, consumers who want to get the lower end of the device for financial reasons or form factor, whatever the reason might be, they are navigating towards, why don't I get a generation -1 or a generation -2?
Right.
So that's the domino, right? So as a result, more people are taking those up. You can get a lot of them back in. In the US market in particular, the carriers who sell most of the devices, 70% of the devices in the US are sold through carrier channels, mobile operator channels. And they have been doing aggressive promotions. One, to bring the consumer in and get them to upgrade, because when they do the trade-in value, high trade-in values like $800 for any devices, they create stickiness because you don't get the $800 right away. It's as bill credit over the next 24 or 36 months. So that's the number one reason they bring in. But then it also brings in those older devices, the Gen -2, Gen -3 type of devices that can be recirculated either for their insurance purposes or the certified pre-owned type of capabilities. So that you can see how the demand is rising day after day after day, and that is creating a shortage in that market as well.
Right. So you mentioned the US. We've talked a little bit about what are some of the other regions. How are the dynamics differing across regions?
Yeah, so in Japan, also we are seeing similar trends, right? Okay. As an example, and I will compare this to 2019, pre-COVID, because COVID kind of changes the stats a little bit. It colorizes slightly differently. So 2019, the used phones, pre-owned phones in Japan were about 6% of the total devices that were sold. Even that is an inflated number because that took into consideration consumers buying in these electronics market they call Akihabara, and that could be just a consumer or it could be just a buyer from Hong Kong or China just going to Japan to get those high quality devices from there, right? So even that is an inflated number. I believe in 2023, that number had come upwards about 15 to 18% of total devices sold.
Right, so double, almost triple maybe.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we can see that there are online stores that have been selling devices, all for the same reasons that we mentioned. In Japan, in addition to that, during the foreign exchange, yen has declined in its value.
Plummeted, yeah.
So as a result, many of the OEMs have jacked up the prices by 20 to 25%, right? The consumer spending cannot increase 20 to 25%, so they are opting to get pre-owned devices in that market. Right. So that also drove up. In Europe, also there is shortage of devices, but for a variety of different reasons. And at some point, we should touch on the regulatory environment as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But Europe has not been as aggressive in the trade-in programs like the US carriers have been, right? There is more focus on sustainability in Europe, but we are still seeing shortage of devices here.
Do you think in Europe it's more because of the fragmented nature of the market? Is that causing problems?
Yeah, I think the fragmented nature of the market definitely plays into equation. The same foreign exchange issue that impacted Japan also impacted Europe, because euro was down pretty significantly as well, so the prices had gone up. So consumers don't have the discretionary income anymore to spend as well. And then the third reason is there is a noise in the marketplace related to CE marking on devices, right?
Yes.
And we have not seen a strong implementation of that in any of the EU countries, but it's something that we are aware of, we are watching very carefully. And as a highly compliant company, we have become very selective in what we export into Europe, because we have the largest volume in the world. And so we get a lot of questions from European carriers, would you be able to provide us with certified pre-owned devices? But to remain compliant with the CE marking, it's going to be a little bit challenging. And I don't know at what point you want to touch on the
regulations.
We can talk about it now, or
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
When we talk about compliance, there's a lot of change in the EU around the regulatory landscape, things like right to repair, or the batteries, or the USB-C charging. I mean, how do you think the industry needs to adapt to that?
So I think it makes it tougher, right? So here is the paradox. Europe is seen as leading in circularity and sustainability, much more aware around that, and regulations around this to facilitate more of circularity and sustainability. When you combine that with restricting the type of devices can contribute to that, that makes it doubly harder, right? The third thing is, I feel the regulation is at least a decade behind technology. So take CE markings as an example. Many of the devices that are coming into Europe don't have the physical etching on the back, but is CE marked and there is a certificate of compliance.
Yeah.
But the customs team don't know how to check that. So they are looking, is it CE, if they are implementing it. They're not implementing it yet, but the way a customs person is trained, is it CE marked or not?
Yeah.
And they put it away. So that makes it a little bit challenging. The second aspect that we're hearing is around this USB-C, right? So I believe starting end of this year or end of next year, you will not be able to bring in any devices, used or new, into European Union that do not have a USB-C component.
Right.
Now that eliminates everything prior to iPhone 14 as an example, right?
Yeah.
That is Gen -1.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and Gen -2 and Gen -3 is where these devices need to be out there if you truly want to, promote circularity.
Well, yeah, the iPhone 11 is still the best.
iPhone 11 is still there. I think
smartphone,
our data shows that the iPhone 12 and iPhone 13 are still the highest volume devices and traded in devices. So I think EU should reconsider some of these regulatory environment, or at the very least the time frame in which they want to implement it. Now, these are all proposals that are floating around. I don't think anything has been implemented yet, but if I could be a voice of reason, I don't have a vote on this matter, but if I could be a voice of reason on this thing, I would say we should reconsider those.
Yeah, and so, I mean, for example, one of the regulatory changes is the need to have a replaceable battery.
Yeah.
Now, for some OEMs, that'll involve a complete rethink of how they design their phones.
Yeah.
Some are doing it, Fairphone's doing it, HMD are doing it, but the others, it's going to have to completely change how they design and manufacture phones.
100%, because in many of these devices, the battery is either a component of the front panel or the back panel, which means you have to replace an entire electronic, because the phone is just divided into two halves, right? And so you're talking about replacing it. Secondly, the battery replacement by whom, right? You can take it to an authorized or a trained repair shop, and they can always replace the battery in any one of your devices. The cost will vary, because if you're replacing an entire half of a phone, it could be upwards of $400 or 400 euros in this case maybe. So I think it's good that it will rethink the design of the phone in itself. But again, these phones are not designed, there is a thought behind the design, right? To accommodate a battery that will meet the demand of a consumer, which is, I need to be able to go 16 to 18 hours without charging, which when we are in this trade show-like environment, we know how important that is, right? In fact, we are handing out these wireless recharging blocks because we think it'll be very useful for people to have it. That feel free to take one of these with you guys if it's helpful. And so now when you redesign that, let's ask the consumer, will you be happy with a phone that's got a replaceable battery but loses capacity by 20%? Absolutely not. The number one demand from every consumer is more battery life, right? So I think these, I don't know whether the regulators or people who have got experience in the industry or in consumer electronics show, but I think getting some partners engaged in these discussions are very, and of course you can't only put OEMs in the seat, right? Because they have a vested interest in there. But there are neutral parties like Assurant, who we don't have a dog in the hunt, right? So we could easily be a very objective advisor in that space.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the OEMs then, there's quite a stark contrast or contradiction between the desire for OEMs to, of course, sell as many new devices as possible, but then there's this push towards making the devices last longer and the replacement rates are getting longer. So from the OEM's perspective, they need to balance sustainability versus commercial performance.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it is another one of those interesting challenges that our industry poses, right? But if you look a point in time, such as now, where we are still coming back from the pandemic, supply chain challenges, etc., and we talked earlier about how those limited parts are being utilized into the higher end phones, right? So take Apple as an example. The 15 Pros and Pro Maxes are the ones that are selling quite heavily. Now, obviously, every OEM wants their consumers to be in the ecosystem, right? So the smart way of thinking about it, I'd rather get my customer into the ecosystem with a lower end phone that they want, so that when they're ready to upgrade to the next one, they will go end up buying a newer phone as a result of doing that stuff. So I think it's an interesting paradox, but I think there is rationale behind helping the consumer adopt a pre-owned device. And I think most OEMs understand this, and they are happy to do that. Now, there are OEMs who straddle their SKUs across all price ranges, starting from $150 all the way up to $1,200, right? For them, it might be a challenge, because I'm saying, hey, why do you want to get a used phone? Why don't you get one of my lower end phones that can do that? But then again, that doesn't contribute towards sustainability. I don't know, you're probably familiar with our product called Carbon IQ, right? It's a brilliant product. And what Carbon IQ does is, it's a scientific way of measuring your carbon footprint associated with devices, right? That's what we focus on. So think about it, and I'll use illustrative numbers, right? These are, for example, when you buy a brand new phone, you're creating a carbon footprint of approximately 90 kilograms, right? And if you traded in a phone as a result of that, you create an offset. So the net comes down to about 50 kilograms of carbon footprint. Now, if you traded in and if you bought a repurposed phone, you drop that further down to about 30 to 40 kilograms of CO2. You're never really getting into zero, because there is some carbon footprint created by repurposing these devices,
logistics,
repair, logistics, movement of devices, etc. Electricity that you're using at that period, all of those things. So net is about 30, 40 footprint, but that's a lot better than 90 kilograms of CO2, right? So I think those are considerations. Using Carbon IQ to track it, report it, educate the consumer on it, will give the OEMs a lot more insights into doing that. So that's our goal with the sustainability part of our business, because we feel like last year we touched about 22 million devices, right? So by far the largest volume in the world. So we also feel a responsibility around making sure that we are educating the industry on the right way to do this and giving them the tools, more importantly, to be able to measure it, right? Because what you can't measure, you can't manage.
Right.
So that we start with that premise. So I think that there are a lot of good things happening in where you can participate in the repurposed device ecosystem without cannibalizing your new device sales.
Brilliant. Okay. You talked about measuring. I probably can't leave without asking you about AI, because AI is everywhere.
Yeah.
You're probably bored about talking about it. I'm bored talking about it. How does AI, what's the role that AI can play in the secondary market, do you think?
Yeah, in a couple of different ways, right? So first of all, just as a jest, somebody was asking me that last year it was circularity and sustainability everywhere. You don't see that anywhere. Now it's all AI. I said, well, marketing can only focus on so many things. So AI is the buzzword and we are focusing on that.
Yep.
So the AI world has, particularly in the device ecosystem, has been very impressive, right? If you look at some of the devices that have come out, right, and you know, AI you can really just get very fancy with it, but I'm more pragmatic about what it's doing. So look at some of the new devices that have just come out that is helping the visually impaired, right? Their ability to take a picture but they cannot see what's going on, and the AI system tells the person that, hey, you have one object in focus, take a picture, whether it's a selfie or the back-facing camera, immediately helping people, right? People who cannot speak, how they can, you know, type something and it can translate it for the receiver. The productivity improvement tools, like me being able to pick up a phone and call somebody in Japan, it recognizes that I'm calling a Japanese number, and I have the option to translate whatever I'm speaking in English to the receiver in Japanese, and whatever they're speaking in Japanese back to me in English. Yep. Now, there are people complain, oh, it's patchy, it's delayed, and things like that. But think about, this is not a word-for-word translation, it's a contextual translation. Yep. And you can't contextually translate something unless the next few words arrive. So that's where that delay comes in. So people should try using that and appreciate the technology behind it before the criticism comes around it. I have seen capabilities where you can place a phone call to somebody in English, and then at the end of the phone call, get a summary in an email of that phone call. How brilliant is that from a productivity improvement standpoint? Otherwise, I had a conversation with you, now I'm sending an email to my team, you know, I'm taking twice the amount of time in order to do that stuff. I'm seeing it to be brilliant, but where in the sustainability world it starts to play an important thing is, and this is probably particularly true for the Android ecosystem, is because that's the platform where we are seeing the AI innovations coming in, is people who are using older devices, they now don't feel they should be necessarily buying new devices just to get the AI platform. Because Android is planning on supporting that AI platform capabilities downstream to Gen -2, Gen -3 type of devices. Yeah. That immediately gives you the benefit, and you don't have to upgrade a device just to get the AI capabilities. Yeah, so I'm just seeing really pragmatic and brilliant uses of AI in our device ecosystem. It's very, very impressive.
Okay, and what about in the secondary market, things like grading?
Oh, we have been using AI for grading for, I don't know, 5 years now. Yeah. And we use it as for two reasons. One is productivity improvement. If you're having a person check the visual quality of a phone, A, it can take a lot long. B, it can be very subjective. You might look at a phone and say, hey, this has got minor scratches, it's an A grade. I might look at the same thing, I'm going to be a tough grader, and I'll say, it looks like it's a B grade, right? Mm-hmm. Now the machine takes it all away. It consistently grades everything to one level. So the buyers are a lot more confident, right? Yeah. Assurant said it's an A grade, it's an A grade. If I'm buying 1,000 devices, they'll all be A grade, right? Yeah. So they get that consistency associated with that. And we've been using neural network and vision, machine learning for doing that stuff. Then it improves the productivity, because the average human can look at a device and let's say they take 3 or 4 minutes for grading a device from a cosmetic standpoint. The machine takes 2 seconds. So productivity is improved, we can process. And remember, these are depreciating assets. The longer they sit in a warehouse, the less value they have. Right. So getting them out pretty quickly with a high productivity is very important. So we have been using AI in that context for a long time, and it's been very, very productive for us.
Brilliant. Okay, we could talk about this for days.
Yes.
I imagine you are talking about it for days. But we'll leave it there. Biju, thank you so much. Thanks for joining me. It's been great talking to you.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Always great. Thank you. And for those watching, thank you very much, and join us next time. Bye.